A wild Mustang mare charged straight into the jaws of two bears, tearing her foal apart, just to protect a man she had never met. No legend. No metaphor. It really happened. And it was only the beginning. In the middle of blood, roars, and earth ripped open beneath pounding hooves, the mare didn't run. She didn't turn away. She chose to fight. And then, she stood between the man and the beasts. He didn't understand. And no one could explain why. But there are moments in life when the eyes of a wild creature make your soul go still. This isn't a story about taming. It's a story about a choice made by the wild. And it just might make you question, who really needs saving? Join us now for a breathtaking story that will leave you speechless and changed. Wind River, Wyoming. It was a morning like any other, still, mist clinging to each blade of grass, and the air thick with the damp scent of moss, rotting wood, and pine needles. But to Caleb Madsen, silence was never just silence. Not anymore. Years of living reclusively in the forest had taught him that when the woods went completely quiet, something was always wrong. And that morning, the woods were far too quiet. Caleb stood on the front steps of his cabin, a cup of cold coffee in hand, eyes scanning the distant ridge of dark pines, now veiled by a thin, ghostly fog. He had once been a military veterinarian, had seen things that could break men. But it wasn't the war that made him walk away from society. It was the silence. The unbearable silence that followed every life he couldn't save. And this time, the silence had returned, not in a field hospital, but here, in these woods. He set the mug down on the step, slipped a handful of dry oats into his coat pocket, a habit from his walks along the ridges, leaving food for the wild mustangs that sometimes passed nearby. He didn't bring a rifle. Just a coil of rope, a folding knife, and a thick, gnarled branch he'd picked up from the yard. Heavy. Rough. Good enough if he came across a wolf. Or something worse. The trail into the forest was slick from morning dew. Caleb walked with the sure-footed calm of someone who had long become a part of the terrain. Elk Ridge was nearly an hour's hike from the cabin, but he didn't feel tired. There was something else, something strange. As if a presence was calling to him, not in words, but in an ancient, primal pull. And then, he heard it. A roar. Not a wolf. Not a mountain lion. It was deeper, rougher, like a snarl wrapped around an explosion. Caleb stopped instantly. His back straightened. His grip tightened around the branch. The air felt heavier, thick as syrup. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. A few ravens burst from the treetops, cawing frantically. Then he heard it again. A second sound. One that ripped through the silence like a scream from the bones of the earth. A whinny. No. Not a whinny. A scream. High. Shattered. Drenched in pain. Caleb ran. He forgot his age. His exile. His silence. He wasn't a man in hiding anymore. He was a soldier again, no uniform, no orders, only the thunder of his heart and the cry of something innocent, something suffering. He tore through the trees, stumbled down a slick embankment, hands clawing at roots and stones to keep upright. And then, he saw them. A foal. Red gold, trembling beneath a fallen tree. Lorian. That's what he'd call it later. Its coat burned like copper in the light, eyes wide with terror. One leg was bloodied, clawed, the flank smeared crimson. And not far from it, two black bears. full grown. One already had blood on its snout. Not its own. Caleb had no gun, no plan, just a branch in his hand and a heart that refused to turn away. He roared, a raw, cracking shout. Hey! Hey! Get away! He swung the branch wide, took one step forward, then another. No hesitation. The first bear flinched. The second growled, teeth bared, digging into the ground. Caleb knew if he hesitated for even a second, it would be over. The foal didn't move. It couldn't. It lay collapsed in the dirt, breathing hard, eyes locked on Caleb as if hoping for a miracle. The second bear lunged. Caleb gripped the branch tighter. And for a heartbeat, the world froze. Only him, the bear, and the blow that was about to end everything. The moment the bear lunged, the world seemed to explode out of reality. Caleb stood frozen, every muscle locked. The heavy branch in his hand felt useless against the massive weight barreling toward him. He braced for the impact, for the roar, for the blood. Maybe his, maybe the foal's, lying motionless just behind him. But then, a sharp, slicing cry tore through the trees. Not a gunshot, not a growl, a scream, a whinny, shrill as a blade cutting the sky. From the depths of the forest, a blazing golden blur shot out like living lightning. There was no time to see, no time to think. Only movement, power, instinct. Thud. An iron hoof slammed into the bear's side, the sound echoing like rock shattering on stone. The bear roared, stumbled sideways into the underbrush, rolled hard into the dirt. Before it could rise, another blow came, this time from behind. Caleb stepped back on reflex. Dirt exploded into the air. Pine needles spun in the vortex of hoofs. Standing before him was a wild Mustang mare, her body burning with light. Her coat gleamed gold, streaked with sweat that shimmered like a sunlit stream. A long black mane draped across her face, veiling eyes that now stared directly at Caleb. No roar, no scream, none was needed. Everything froze. She stood still, between Caleb and the bears. Lorian whimpered softly behind her. The mare turned her head slightly, just once. But she didn't move from her post. She didn't break eye contact with Caleb. His hand began to tremble. His back soaked through with sweat. His gut clenched, the same instinct he'd once known in war zones, where the line between life and death was as thin as breath. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a ritual of the wild. And Caleb, whether he meant to or not, had stepped into its sacred circle. The first bear backed away, eyes never leaving the mare. It let out one last growl, defiant but restrained. And then, sensing the shift, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The second bear groaned, dragging its battered body into the wet grass, retreating. They left. Not a claw had touched Caleb. Not a single blow struck the foal. Not because Caleb had won, but because someone else had chosen to fight for him. The mare turned. This time, fully. No bears. No movement. Just her and him. The distance between them was now just a few strides. Caleb had never stood so close to something so wild, without fences, without reins, without anything but the fragile thread of trust, or the edge of death. Her eyes were dark and deep, like an ancient well. But in them, he saw no wildness. No reflex. no threat. He saw memory. Not his. Hers. As if the mare before him had seen him before. In another life. Time held its breath. No wind. No birdsong. Just a gaze between a man and a soul not born of man. Lorian let out a small, broken whinny. The mare turned back toward her foal. Her steps were slow, not because she was weak, but because it felt like she was carrying the weight of something ancient. She lowered her head and touched her muzzle gently to Lorian's neck. The foal flinched from pain, but did not cry. Did not panic. He understood. His mother had returned. Caleb stood there, motionless. He didn't move. He didn't dare. He wasn't allowed to. And then, she did something no one expected. The mare turned. Again. No sound. No step. Just a look. Straight at him. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't the way wild animals assess danger. It was the kind of look. As if she were asking him a question, one only he could answer. And in that moment, Caleb Madsen, the man who had abandoned the human world, who believed the best part of him had died years ago, felt every wall inside him collapse beneath that gaze. The mare turned once more. She walked away, leading her child with calm, measured steps. No rush. No fear. She left behind a man standing in the middle of the woods, his chest pounding, the branch fallen from his hand, and a question echoing without an answer. Why? Why did she look at him like that? Why didn't she run? Why did she save them? And deep in Caleb's heart, a strange feeling clung tight. Had they really just met for the first time? He turned and looked toward where the golden figure had vanished. The forest was still as before. But now, everything had changed. 3 days later, Caleb didn't know what had drawn him back. It wasn't hope. It wasn't duty. And it sure as hell wasn't curiosity. It felt more like an echo. A quiet call from something he'd never been able to name. A strange stillness within him, a hollow that nothing had touched in years. But ever since that gaze, her gaze, the silence hadn't felt the same. He returned to the clearing, the one where the bear had lunged, where the earth still held the faded scent of blood, and bear tracks lingered faintly beneath the moss. Caleb stood there for a long time, listening to the wind weaving through the pines, and to his own heartbeat, pounding like it awaited judgment. No movement. No whinny. No glint of gold. Just the forest. Cold. Still. Indifferent. As it had always been. He lowered himself onto a moss-covered rock, pulled open his canvas satchel. From it, he took a small handful of dry oats and placed them on a flat stone near the tree's roots. He didn't know why. Couldn't explain it. He just thought, if they ever came back, at least they wouldn't find his hands completely empty. He didn't stay. Didn't want to become the man waiting on miracles. He simply left it and turned away. But before he could take more than a few steps, there was a sound behind him. Not the wind. Not a falling branch. Caleb turned, slowly, as if moving too fast might shatter what was forming behind him. A pine branch shifted, and from the shadows, Lorian stepped out. The foal. That same reddish coat, dimmer under the trees. Still frail, but standing. Still limping, but steady. He looked at Caleb. Not afraid, but not approaching either. There was a space between them. The space of species, of memory, of instinct. But he still looked. And somehow, that was enough. Caleb didn't breathe, didn't dare move. It felt like his heart had dropped to the forest floor, beating in sync with the foal's hoofs. And then, Solara appeared. She emerged from the shadows like she'd never left. That golden blaze, quiet, powerful, unannounced. Her ears were alert, her body tense. But not bracing. Not aggressive. She didn't look at Caleb at first. She looked at Lorien. And only when the foal let out the softest of whinnies did Solara turn her eyes toward the man. She didn't move forward. Didn't retreat. She simply stood there. And the forest held its breath. Caleb didn't know how long passed. A minute? 5? A lifetime? No one moved. No one spoke. Because their presence, just their presence, was enough to change the rhythm of the woods. A squirrel shifted direction. A bird went silent. Even the trees stopped whispering. This was no longer human territory. Not a place a man could walk through like he owned it. This was something older. And Caleb knew. He would only be allowed to remain if he entered with humility. He bowed his head. Not much, but enough. Not in fear, but as a thank you. For presence. For grace. Lorien took a tentative step forward. Caleb didn't raise a hand. He simply stepped back, half a pace. And with the slowest of motions, reached for his satchel again. He opened it, took out a bit more oats, and laid it gently on the earth. Then he rose. Did not advance. Did not expect. He backed away toward the trees. Once more. He did not wait. He simply left it behind. As he walked away, he didn't know if they approached the offering. Didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because this time, Caleb wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply learning how to let his heart open again. And then, to let in only what was worthy of entering. That night, Caleb sat by the fireplace in his log cabin, a weathered journal in his hand. The same one he'd sworn he'd never open again. The first page was faded, the ink long blurred by time. He wrote on the second line, "She returned. And I did too." Then he closed the book. Not to end something, but to begin it. Outside the window, the forest remained black and still. But inside that darkness, Caleb felt something changing. Not in the trees, not in the air, but deep within himself. No one told Caleb to return, but he did. It wasn't a sudden pull like before. It was steady, silent, and strangely sacred. On the fourth morning, there were no whinnies, no sign of Solara, no golden glint between the trees, just the forest, and a silence that no longer threatened, but waited. Caleb carried a bag of oats, a folded blanket, and this time, an old, weathered journal. Not to write in, but to remind himself he was still alive. He sat down at the familiar moss-covered spot, but farther back this time. Not from fear, but from understanding. What is truly wild only comes when you stop demanding it to. He didn't call out, didn't try to speak, only whispered to himself, like sending a breath into the wind. You have every right to be unsure. I once doubted the world too. If you don't come today, that's okay. But if you do, I'll be here. Nothing more. He placed a small handful of oats at the edge of the clearing, then opened the journal, flipping through yellowed pages from a time he still thought he was whole. Time passed slowly. The woods did not move. Only the lightest breeze, just enough to stir a leaf not yet ready to fall. And then he heard it. A footstep. Not the creeping kind of a predator, but a footstep, learning how to trust. Caleb didn't lift his head. Not yet. Not wanting to disturb the rhythm of that fragile courage. Then, a reddish blur appeared in the corner of his eye. Lorian. But this time, the foal wasn't hiding. He stepped forward. Slowly. Without being called. Without being lured. Caleb turned his head. And for the first time, looked Lorian in the eye. And in that gaze, the hesitation was beginning to melt. Lorian kept walking. Closer than he'd ever dared before. And then, he stopped. Right in front of Caleb's knee. No more distance. No more waiting. Then, a gentle nudge on the shoulder. Soft as wind. As memory. As if something lost long ago had found its way home. Caleb choked up. He didn't cry right away. He simply raised his hand to his own brow. Not to soothe, but to ask without words. Are you sure? And then Lorian pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest. All the old pain returned at once. But this time, it didn't shatter him. It unlocked the door to a heart he'd kept sealed for years. He cried, but not with screams, not with sobs, just tears, like someone finally allowed to be alive again. He remembered her hand, his daughter's laughter, ashes still warm, and the space, the hollow that had never been filled. Lorian didn't leave. He just stood there, like a silent sentinel. Caleb gave a small nod. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because that moment was a contract between two souls who had both lost too much. Solara did not appear, but the air itself carried a weight of permission. That evening, Caleb opened his journal and wrote. He didn't come closer because I asked. He came because I didn't. And when he did, I remembered I still had a heart. Dusk thickened. Lorian turned back to the trees. Caleb packed his things. But before leaving, he smiled. Not because he had tamed something wild, but because a wild soul had chosen not to leave him. One morning, the rain came without warning, and the real test began. It came fast. The sky had been gray since dawn, but no one would have guessed it would pour like that. Caleb rose early as usual, packed a bag of oats, and threw on a heavier coat. As he crossed the familiar slope toward the usual spot, cold gusts slapped his face like a silent warning. Today wouldn't be like the others. When he arrived, the clearing was empty. No hoofprints. No Lorian. Not even a golden flicker beneath the trees. Only rain, beginning to fall, soft at first, then steady, then fierce. Caleb called out gently, but only the rain answered. He waited a moment longer, then stepped deeper into the woods. Instinct, honed by years of reading subtle signs in animals, alerted him to something odd: broken branches, uneven tracks in the mud. "Lorian," he called softly, his voice trembling beneath the rain. No answer. Then a whinny. Pained. Distant. Barely audible through the downpour. Caleb ran. He slipped past slick pine roots, clutched at branches for balance, dodged thorns. Then he saw it, a narrow ravine cut into the earth, muddy and dark. At the bottom, Lorian. The colt lay sideways, half covered in wet dirt, his leg caught under an exposed tree root. The limb was swollen, grotesquely shaped. His sides trembled, flanks rising and falling too fast. God! Lorian! Caleb dropped to his knees at the ravine's edge, ready to jump down, but the slope was too slick. He backed up, found another route, a softer decline where his boots could grip. His hands were already numb, but his mind was crystal clear. As he reached the bottom, movement on the opposite side made him stop. Solara. She stood tall, soaked head to hoof. Her mane clung to her face. Ears pointed forward. Not charging. Not blocking. Just watching. Her body trembled with cold, but her gaze burned steady. Caleb raised a hand slowly, palm open as if to say, "I'm not here to take. I'm here to help." Solara did not move. But she didn't step back either. She had seen her foal, injured, and the human. And this time, she chose not to interfere. To Caleb, that alone was a miracle. He slid down, ignoring the sting of thorns and the bite of cold water. Mud clung to his sleeves. A branch sliced his palm. He didn't stop. Lorian gasped, eyes wide but not panicked. Caleb crouched close and whispered, "We've faced worse. Trust me." He pulled off his scarf, fashioned a makeshift wrap for the leg. Then, with all the care in the world, he began lifting the colt, not fully, just enough to release the trapped limb. Lorian cried out. Caleb steadied him. Inch by inch, he guided the foal towards solid ground, shielding his body from the rocks and roots. It took over 30 minutes. When he finally laid Lorian on a dry patch above the ravine and wrapped the blanket around him, Caleb collapsed beside him, chest heaving, clothes soaked. Solara had moved closer. A few paces only. Not touching. Not aiding. Just present. And for Caleb, that was everything. He looked up at her. She met his eyes. No defiance. No surrender. Only recognition. The rain still poured. But Caleb's heart had never been clearer. Solara had chosen not to stop him. She let him save her foal. And in the language of the wild, that is the highest form of trust. He stared back at her, not as a man seeking ownership, but as someone grateful just to be allowed to help. They didn't move. Not for minutes. Not even for breath. Only when Lorian finally shifted, nudging into Caleb's side, did the world seem to restart. Solara blinked, not away, but slowly, like saying, "This is allowed. For now." Caleb lowered his head in return. That night, he wrote only one line in his journal. "Today, I was not tested by nature, I was entrusted by it." The rain stopped just before dawn. Mist clung to the pine trees like whispered prayers, and the sky took on that gray-blue hue between night and morning, when nothing yet belongs to the day. Caleb opened his eyes slowly, aching in every muscle. He hadn't slept, not really. He had kept watch beside Lorien, curled under the damp blanket like a child too small for the world's cruelties. Lorien's breathing had steadied through the night, though his injured leg remained swollen. He stirred slightly as Caleb reached over to check the wrap. "You're going to be all right," Caleb whispered, not knowing if he said it for the colt or for himself. Then, the sound. Not a rustle. Not a step. A presence. Caleb turned his head slowly. Solara stood there. Silent. Unmoving. But this time, something had changed. She wasn't there to test, or to guard from a distance. She was just there, part of this space, of this moment. Like she had always been part of it, long before Caleb arrived. He gave a slight nod. No words. No gestures of ownership. Just quiet acknowledgement. Then, slowly, he unrolled the canvas and rope from his pack. It had once been meant for supplies. Now, it would be a stretcher. He worked carefully, weaving soft ties through the corners, patting the center with moss and the drier portions of the blanket. He glanced at Solara once. She didn't move. But her eyes followed every action, as if learning, as if measuring. When he finally slid the stretcher beside Lorien, the colt resisted only briefly before settling into it. Caleb looped the rope around his shoulders and waist, fashioning a crude harness. The first tug made his knees scream. The second made his spine arch. But the third held, and they moved. Caleb pulled. Lorien lay silent. And Solara walked beside them. Not behind. Not ahead. Beside. They climbed. The path was steep and slick, but the earth no longer fought back. The rain had softened the ground just enough to give grip. Mist curled around their feet like tendrils of memory. The weight on Caleb's back was crushing, but it was more than the foal. It was everything that had been buried inside him, the grief, the guilt, the quiet yearning to be needed again. Every breath was a prayer without words. Every step was a vow he hadn't realized he'd made. Solara kept pace. Once, she stepped ahead and nudged aside a fallen branch. Another time, she slowed, ears turning, as if to scan the silence for danger. But never once did she leave them. When they reached the ridge, the sun finally broke the horizon. Not fully, just a blade of gold piercing the fog. Caleb laid the stretcher down beneath a tall pine, where drying needles made a natural bed. Lorien shifted slightly, letting out a small, soft sound, not pain, but recognition. Caleb collapsed to his knees. Not from exhaustion. From something deeper. He looked up, and Solara was still there. Standing. Silent. Staring at him. And something in her eyes said what no words ever could. You did not take. You walked beside. The wind passed through the trees like a sigh. 3 figures stood in stillness, man, mare, and colt. No commands. No fences. No need to prove anything. Only trust. That evening, Caleb sat with his journal again. He wrote more than usual. She didn't need me to lead. She only needed to see that I wouldn't leave. And in that silence, I became part of something older than language. Outside the tent of twilight mist, the 3 of them stayed. A man trying to remember how to live. A foal learning that not all pain lasts. And a Mustang mare who, in her silence, said, "You may stay." The ridge where Caleb set up camp had no name on any map. It was just a forgotten patch of wild earth, a clearing hidden by old pines and thick underbrush, where even the wind seemed to pass gently, as if respecting something sacred. He hadn't planned to stay long. But after carrying Lorien to safety, and watching Solara refuse to leave, there was no question, he wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed were marked by silence, but not emptiness. It was a silence that lived, breathing, pulsing, observing. Caleb set up a shelter using canvas and rope between two trees. Not a cabin, not a trap. Just enough to keep the rain off and the cold out. He laid Lorien on a bed of dry pine needles, checked his leg twice a day, cleaned the wound, and changed the wrap. The swelling went down slowly, but each night the cold breathed easier. And each night, without fail, Solara stood watch. She never lay down. She never blinked for long. She stood at the edge of the clearing, head high, ears sharp. Not as a prisoner. Not as a guard. But as a sentinel of something unspoken. Caleb had long since stopped talking. Words felt clumsy here. He simply moved, slow, deliberate, reverent. Every morning, he boiled water over a low flame, prepared a shallow pan of soaked oats, and left it near the pine line. He'd back away, sit cross-legged with his hands open on his knees, and wait. Lorien, still limping, would approach cautiously. Sometimes he ate. Sometimes he simply rested, head against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb never reached first. Never assumed. He only welcomed. And Solara watched. On the fifth night, as the mist rolled in thicker than usual, Caleb stirred from a shallow sleep to find the world changed. Solara was no longer at the edge. She was lying beside them. Not touching, but near. Her golden body curled not far from Lorien's, her breathing deep and steady. Caleb did not move. He barely even breathed. He simply lay there, stunned not by fear, but by the trust it represented. She had lowered herself, exposed her side. She had closed her eyes. No wild Mustang did that without choosing to. The fire had died to embers. The wind hummed through the trees like an old lullaby. And in that quiet, Caleb understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about survival. It was about witnessing. Being seen. Being chosen. That night, no one spoke. But three beings, a man, a colt, and a mare, breathed the same air, under the same canopy of stars, without a need for words. They had found something the world had no name for. And the forest, ancient and wise, kept their secret. The calm didn't last. It never does, not when something pure grows in a place the world forgot. The wild has its rhythms, but people come with questions, with forms, with rules. Lucinda Hayes was one of the good ones. A senior ranger for the Wind River District, she'd worked this land for over a decade. She respected the wild, or at least tried to. But when the station received a report of a bear attack and strange human activity up on the North Ridge, protocol kicked in. She rode in alone, early morning mist curling around her boots as she stepped off the ATV. Clipboard in hand. Trank gun at her side. The moment her eyes fell on the scene, something in her froze. A canvas shelter. A man. A colt. And a Mustang mare who did not run. Lucinda stopped short. Her boots crunched the damp pine needles, and Caleb looked up from where he was cleaning Lorien's leg. He didn't speak. Neither did she, not at first. She just took it all in. The way the foal leaned into the man. The quiet steadiness of the golden mare behind him. The kind of stillness you only find between souls that have long since dropped their weapons, "You must be Caleb Madsen," she said finally, tone calm but clipped. He nodded. "And you're not here for coffee?" Lucinda cracked a tired smile. "No. We got word from a hiker down in Elk Ridge. Said they heard bear calls. Some shouting. The usual panic." Caleb didn't flinch. "There was a bear. 3 days ago. No one was harmed. Except the bear, maybe." Lucinda stepped closer, eyes narrowing at Lorian. "That foal, he doesn't look good." "He wasn't supposed to make it," Caleb said quietly. "But he did." She paused, watching him, then glanced at Solara. "The mare," she wailed. Caleb only nodded. Lucinda clicked her tongue softly, jotting something on her clipboard. "If she's still with him, she's his dam. That makes this legally a protected animal under federal classification. But it also means, if the foal's injured, I'm required to transport him to a rehab center." That word, transport, echoed like thunder. Caleb stood. Not aggressively. But something shifted in his frame. "You're not taking him." Lucinda held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue, Caleb. I'm here to do my job. He's hurt. We have medical staff and..." A rustle behind them. Solara. She had stepped forward. Not charging. Not flinching. Just moved. Between Lucinda and Lorian. Her body was still, her ears pinned but not flattened. Her head low. Breath steady. She didn't bare her teeth or stamp her hoofs. She didn't need to. The message was clear. "This ends here." Lucinda went very still. "She's not domesticated," she said under her breath. "That stance, she's not bluffing." Caleb didn't move. "She's a mother. And she's already fought worse than you to keep him safe." For a long moment, only the forest spoke. Dripping branches. A crow cawing somewhere overhead. The faint rustle of pine needles under the weight of meaning. Lucinda lowered the clipboard. "How long do you plan to stay here?" "As long as it takes." She looked again at Lorian. Then at Solara. Then, unexpectedly, at Caleb. And she nodded. Not a surrender, but a shift. She stepped back, slowly. Not turning her back. Not raising her voice. Just giving space. "You didn't find them," Caleb said quietly. "They found me." Lucinda gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, I can see that." She took a breath. The kind that pulls the weight of duty back into your bones. "I'll file it as an observation. Ongoing. Unresolved." Caleb nodded, eyes never leaving Solara. "If you're wrong, if he gets worse, then I'll carry him." Again. Lucinda holstered her pen. "Just don't make me regret this." And with that, she turned and walked back through the trees. Solara remained still until the sound of the ATV faded into the mist. Only then did she step back toward Lorian. Only then did the forest exhale. 3 days passed. No ranger returned. No questions were asked. But Caleb could feel the shift. Something in Lucinda's eyes before she left had told him the truth. She wouldn't be able to hold off the system for long. She bought them time, yes, but not forever. And the forest knew it, too. The birds grew quieter. The wind stopped lingering around their makeshift shelter. Even the shadows seemed more alert. It came on the 4th morning. The soft, clipped sound of tires on gravel far below. Then the mechanical purr of an engine, a different one. Government issued. Heavy. Caleb stood at the ridge's edge and watched as a white utility truck rolled up slowly onto the lower access road. Two figures stepped out. One in green uniform, the other in gray. Lucinda. And someone else. Caleb's gut clenched. He turned back to Solara and Lorien. The colt was standing today, barely, resting most of his weight on his good leg. Solara had been hovering closer, her breathing shallow with something between tension and knowing. She looked at Caleb. And Caleb understood. No more waiting. No more hoping the world would leave them alone. It was time to disappear. The path Caleb chose wasn't marked. It didn't exist on any ranger map. But he had known it for years, a memory from his lonelier days, a place he'd gone once to disappear from his own past. A narrow ravine between cliffs where no truck could fit, where even sound seemed hesitant to echo. He gathered the pack. Water. A few apples. Medical gauze. And the canvas. Then he wrapped Lorien's leg gently, tied soft ropes under the colt's belly, fashioned a sling again. This time, Solara helped. She walked beside him as they dragged Lorien slowly into the trees. Not ahead. Not behind. Beside. The climb was brutal. The weight heavier than ever. But Caleb didn't falter. Not once. Twice, Lorien cried out. Twice, Caleb whispered, just a little more. Just a little more. Solara never broke stride. Behind them, the sound of boots echoed faintly. Someone was coming. But the trees closed in around them. The ground narrowed into a cleft of granite and root. And then, they passed into the hidden gorge. It was as if the world stopped. Mist hung low between stone walls. A stream trickled softly down moss-covered rocks. No noise from below could reach them here. Caleb collapsed near the water, lowering Lorien carefully onto a dry patch of pine needles. Solara stood above them. A sentinel. A mother. A guardian of something wilder than freedom. Caleb sat back against a tree, lungs burning, heart pounding. But not from fear. From release. He had made his choice. No badge. No rule. No paper would take this away. He looked at Lorien, who now dozed quietly. Then at Solara. She was watching him again, but not with caution. With something else. Respect. And when she finally lay down, not far, not close, but near enough, Caleb understood. He hadn't just rescued them. They had rescued him, too. That night, as stars peeked between the ravine walls, and the rest of the world looked elsewhere, Caleb opened his journal and wrote one line. Let them call it running. We'll call it choosing. The gorge had become a sanctuary. No maps led there. No voices echoed into it. No rules reached that high. For the first time in what felt like years, Caleb allowed his body to rest without his heart guarding it. Lorien's condition improved by the hour. The swelling in his leg had begun to subside. He could rise now without help. Could take 3, then 4 steps before collapsing back into the pine bedding Caleb had arranged. And each step, no matter how shaky, brought light into Caleb's eyes that hadn't been there in years. He spent the days gathering wild berries, boiling water in a battered tin pot, writing fragments of thoughts into his old journal. Sometimes, he spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to the silence itself. I thought I'd forgotten how to witness something grow. By the fifth morning, Lorien managed to trot for 5 full paces, his mane bouncing with defiance. Then, he turned around and looked at Caleb, not as a foal looking for help, but as something else entirely. A survivor. Caleb dropped to his knees and laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since he'd held his daughter's picture one last time. That night, clouds covered the stars. The fire was low, barely more than coals. Caleb sat wrapped in a blanket, his journal closed beside him, arms resting on his knees. Lorien slept nearby. And Solara, she hadn't moved in hours. She stood at the tree-line, her silhouette a statue, golden even in the dark. Then, without a sound, she approached. Caleb saw her only when she was steps away. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. Solara walked slowly, as if crossing something invisible between them. She stopped a few feet away, head lowered. Her breath was visible in the cold night air, long and quiet. And then, she did something Caleb had never seen her do before. She lay down. Right beside him. Not near Lorien. Not at a distance. Beside him. Caleb sat frozen, not out of fear, but reverence. He turned his head slightly. Her eyes were on his. Not guarded. Not wild. Soft. And in them, forgiveness. Not for what he had done, but for what he had once abandoned. Caleb swallowed. I didn't know I needed this, he whispered. Any of it. Solara blinked slowly. And then, she leaned forward. Her forehead touched his shoulder. A gesture. Small. But enough to undo the decades inside him. His eyes burned. Tears welled. He didn't look away. He didn't need to. He had been chosen. Not tolerated. Not accepted. Chosen. By something wild. By something whole. By something he could never command, only honor. She stepped back a moment later, curling herself into the earth, her back touching his for a heartbeat, then settling into sleep. Caleb sat motionless for a long time. Then he reached for his journal and, with hands still trembling, wrote. She lay beside me. Not to be tamed. Not to be understood. Just to say, I choose you again. Outside the ravine, the world moved on. But within it, something had shifted. Not just for a man. Not just for a horse. But for the space between them. It had finally learned how to forgive. It happened on a morning draped in silver mist. The gorge lay quiet as usual, soft, untouched, cloaked in a hush that came only with deep wilderness. Caleb stirred the embers of the fire. Lorien slept nearby, his breath slow and even. Solara stood at the edge of the trees, unmoving. Then, the ground began to hum. It was so faint at first that Caleb thought he imagined it. A rhythm in the earth. A pulse older than speech. He stood slowly, eyes squinting through the shifting fog. And from the eastern ridge, through the veil of white, came shadows. One by one, they emerged, tall, proud, wild. Mustangs. 7, maybe 8 at first. Then more. Hoofs silent on moss. Eyes wide, bodies sleek. And leading them, a black stallion. Massive. Thick-maned. With a coat like coal and eyes like stone. Every step he took was deliberate. Every muscle honed by wind, winter, and war. The herd fanned out, cautious but curious. Solara did not move. Then she stepped forward. She didn't run to them. She didn't whinny or cry. She walked. Deliberate. Calm. A queen who hadn't forgotten her crown. The stallion watched her approach. The others flanked behind him, alert. Solara stopped halfway between the herd and the camp, then turned toward Caleb. And behind her, Lorien stirred. He rose on trembling legs, not with fear, but with instinct. He looked at Solara, then at the herd. Then, he began to walk. Not away from Caleb, not toward the wild, but into the space between. Solara met him there. She nudged him forward, and then she turned back again, toward the herd, toward the stallion, and without words, without signal, she made her choice known. He lives. Because of him. Her head tilted slightly toward Caleb. Not as a threat. Not as submission. As fact. The stallion's ears twitched. He stepped forward. Snorted. Took in the scent of the colt. Watched the rise and fall of Solara's chest. Then he exhaled. And looked away. Acceptance. One by one, the herd stepped closer. Not to Caleb, but to Lorien. Sniffing. Brushing past him. Recognizing. Solara didn't return to them. Not yet. She stood by Caleb's side as they passed. And when the stallion at last turned his great head and led them down into the deeper folds of the wilderness, she looked once more to the man who had carried her son. And stayed. Not behind. Not under. Beside. Weeks passed. The gorge, once alive with whispers of healing, had gone silent again. Caleb had stayed until he knew, truly knew, that Lorien could run, that Solara had reclaimed her strength, and that the wild had accepted them back. Then, with no fanfare, he packed his worn satchel, whispered one final goodbye to the ravine, and began the long walk home. Back to the cabin. Back to silence. Back to the echo of footsteps on old wooden floors and the creak of the porch he'd once believed would rot before he'd return. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer walked with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he carried a memory. Not of war. Not of grief. But of breath shared in the cold with something untamed and beautiful. It was on a morning like any other, frost on the windows, a kettle just beginning to sing, when Caleb saw it. Outside, beside the old wooden fence post that bordered his meadow, stood a foal. Small. Chestnut-colored. Barely weaned. Its legs looked too thin to hold its weight, and its breath puffed in soft clouds into the cold air. But what caught Caleb's eye wasn't its size or the way it trembled slightly in the dawn light. It was the tail. Braided. A single, simple braid, like a ribbon. Just like the ones his wife used to tie in the manes of horses they once raised together. Before the war. Before the loss. Before the silence. His hands dropped the kettle. Water hissed on the stove. He walked outside slowly, boots crunching frost. The foal didn't move. Didn't shy. Just stood there. Waiting. Caleb stopped a few feet away. His throat burned with words that had no shape. But he didn't need to say anything. He looked out toward the distant woods, toward the ridges where mist still clung to the trees. She had come. She had chosen. And now, she had given. He knelt beside the foal. Reached a hand slowly, gently to its shoulder. It didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned, just slightly. as if remembering a kindness passed down from another. Caleb closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he prayed. Not to a god, not even to the past, but to the present, this moment, this breath. And in that quiet, he whispered, "Message received." The morning frost had not yet melted when Caleb did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He reached for the journal. The one he had tucked deep behind a loose floorboard. The one he swore he'd never open again. He sat down by the window, light spilling and pale and golden, and with fingers slightly trembling, turned to a fresh page. And wrote. Some souls were never wild. They were just waiting for someone patient enough to remember they once existed. He paused. The fire cracked behind him. Outside, the wind rustled a memory through the pines. Caleb leaned back and understood. No one could ever tame a wild Mustang. But sometimes, they choose you. And in that moment, you are no longer the same. Solara had vanished back into the woods, a glimmer of gold between trees, never seen again. But Caleb knew she remained. In the hush of the forest. In the footprints that softened after rain. In the breath of a foal asleep under starlight. And Lorian, the colt once left to die, now ran at the head of a new herd. His hooves striking the earth like thunder. His mane flying like memory. Across plains no man had ever named. Because sometimes, a cry in the forest isn't just a call of nature. It's a call to wake something in us we thought had long been lost. A call to remember, to feel, to trust again. To be chosen. If this story moved something deep inside you, let it live on. Leave a comment below, share what part of this journey touched your heart. Like the video. Share it with someone who still believes in the wild. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory for more stories where horses don't just run. They heal us. Because some stories are more than tales. They're soul prints.